Oh, mother. Why do I have to pay the price for your cruelty? Bella said, as she sat down in the dark room, with her hands tied together, tears streaming down her face.
Before we dive deep into this amazing and interesting story, please like and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this.
Bella's heart pounded as she sat in the dimly lit room, her hands tied tightly behind her back. The man who had brought her here was not the kind, smiling person she had seen in the pictures online. His eyes were cold, his voice sharp like a knife. Bella wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. She thought of her mother, Mrs. Mabel, who had forced her to go on this date. "Why did you make me do this?" Bella whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. She had always tried to be a good daughter, but nothing she did was ever enough for her mother. Now, she was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. It all started a few weeks ago. Bella's mother, Mrs. Mabel, had been pressuring her to go out with men and bring home money. "Look at you," Mrs. Mabel would shout. "You are beautiful, but you are useless. Other girls your age are making money with their looks. Why can't you?" Bella would cry herself to sleep every night, wondering why her mother treated her so badly. She often asked her father, Mr. John, if Mrs. Mabel was really her mother. But Mr. John would just sigh and tell her to be patient. He didn't know how to stop his wife's cruel words. One day, Mr. John traveled to a nearby city to look for a better job. He wanted to provide for his family, but he didn't know that his wife would use his absence to make Bella's life even harder. Mrs. Mabel started bringing men home, telling Bella to go out with them and bring back money. "If you don't do this, you will not eat or sleep in this house," Mrs. Mabel threatened. Bella refused every time, but her mother's words cut deep. She felt like she had no choice but to obey. One evening, Mrs. Mabel came home with a big smile on her face. "I found someone for you," she said, showing Bella a picture of a handsome man on her phone. "He is rich and kind. You will go on a date with him tomorrow." Bella shook her head, but her mother's eyes turned cold. "If you don't go, you will regret it," Mrs. Mabel said. Bella felt trapped. She didn't want to go, but she was afraid of what her mother would do if she refused. The next day, Bella dressed up and went to meet the man at a fancy restaurant. He looked just like his picture, but something about him felt off. He smiled too much, and his eyes didn't seem to match his smile. Bella tried to be polite, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After dinner, the man offered to drive her home. Bella hesitated, but she didn't want to upset him. She got into his car, and that's when everything went wrong. The man didn't take her home. Instead, he drove to a remote area and stopped in front of an old, abandoned house. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and sharp. Bella's heart raced as she realized she was in danger. She tried to run, but the man grabbed her and dragged her inside the house. He tied her hands and locked her in a dark room. "You're not going anywhere," he said with a cruel laugh. Bella's mind raced. She didn't know what to do. She thought of her father, who was far away, and her mother, who had forced her into this situation. "Why did you do this to me?" she cried. Days passed, and Bella's hope began to fade. The man came into the room every day, bringing her just enough food and water to keep her alive. He would taunt her, telling her that no one was coming to save her. Bella prayed for a miracle, but deep down, she knew her chances were slim. She thought about her life, how her mother had always made her feel worthless. If I survive this, I will never let anyone control me again, she promised herself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mabel was starting to regret what she had done. She had expected Bella to come home with money, but when her daughter didn't return, she began to panic. She called the man's number, but it was disconnected. She searched everywhere, but there was no sign of Bella. Mrs. Mabel's heart sank as she realized the terrible mistake she had made. "What have I done?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. She tried to reach her husband, Mr. John, but he was too far away to help. A few days later, the police found Bella's body in the abandoned house. She had been tortured and left to die. The news shattered the entire family. Mr. John rushed back home, his heart filled with anger and grief. When he saw his wife, he couldn't contain his rage. "You did this," he shouted. "You forced her into this. You are not her mother. You are a monster." Mrs. Mabel tried to explain, but her words fell on deaf ears. Mr. John packed her bags and threw her out of the house. "You don't deserve to be here," he said, his voice trembling with anger. Mrs. Mabel wandered the streets, her mind filled with guilt and regret. She had lost everything: her daughter, her husband, and her home. She thought about Bella, how she had treated her so badly, and how she had pushed her into danger. "I'm sorry, Bella," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But it was too late. Bella was gone, and nothing could bring her back. The story of Bella spread throughout the city, and people were shocked by what had happened. They talked about how Mrs. Mabel had forced her daughter into danger, and how Bella had paid the ultimate price. Many parents began to think about how they treated their own children, and some even changed their ways. Bella's death was a tragedy, but it also served as a warning to others. Mr. John was left alone, his heart broken by the loss of his daughter. He visited Bella's grave every day, placing flowers and talking to her as if she could hear him. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," he would say, tears in his eyes. He vowed to honor Bella's memory by helping other young girls who were being mistreated. He started a foundation in her name, providing support and resources to those in need. As for Mrs. Mabel, she disappeared into the shadows, her guilt weighing heavily on her soul. She was never seen again, but her story served as a reminder of the consequences of cruelty and greed. Bella's life had been cut short, but her legacy lived on, inspiring others to be kind and to stand up for what is right. And in the heart of the city, where Bella's story began, people remembered her as a symbol of strength and resilience, a young girl who had faced unimaginable challenges but had never lost her spirit.
Thanks for watching.